Same orchid, same flower spike, different color. When this Phalaenopsis first opened, the petals were a deep, saturated purple. A few weeks later, the older flowers looked noticeably softer and paler, while the newest bloom still held more of that original intensity. If you've ever looked at your own orchid and thought, what happened to the color? You are not alone. The first instinct is often to change something immediately. More water, less water, more fertilizer, brighter light, a warmer room, a cooler room. But before you change any part of your care routine, remember one rule that will save you from a lot of unnecessary troubleshooting. A color change is a clue, not a complete diagnosis. Today we are going to work through 8 different reasons. Orchid flowers can fade, darken, or change color. And by the end, you will be able to sort what you are seeing into 3 practical categories: normal, artificial, or worth investigating more closely. The best place to begin is not with fertilizer or a new pot. Begin with the flowers that are already in front of you. Find the oldest open flower on the spike, then find the newest one. Compare them in the same light if you can. Look at the overall shade, the lip, the edges of the petals, and whether the change is gradual and even or irregular and patchy. Then step back and look at the whole plant. Are the leaves firm and normally colored for that orchid? Are the roots in a clear pot, mostly silver when dry and green after watering? Or are many of them collapsed, mushy, hollow, or blackened? Is the flower spike still firm? Are unopened buds continuing to develop? Has the plant recently been moved from a greenhouse or store display into a very different home environment? These observations matter because the same pale flower can mean very different things depending on what the rest of the plant is doing. If the oldest flowers are lighter, but the leaves, roots, spike, and newer flowers all look healthy, that is a very different situation from a plant that is fading while also dropping buds, losing roots, and showing widespread stress. So before you react, collect the clues, and the oldest flower on the spike may give you your first answer. The first reason is simply flower age. And it is probably the easiest explanation to overlook, because we tend to remember the orchid as it looked on the day we bought it. A freshly opened flower is not frozen in time. Once a bloom opens, it continues to age. Its cells are still changing, pigments can become less visually intense, the petal surface can change, and the flower gradually moves towards senescence. On many orchids, especially brightly colored Phalaenopsis hybrids, that aging process can make older flowers look softer, duller, or less saturated than flowers that opened more recently. Sometimes the difference is subtle. Sometimes it is obvious enough that 2 flowers on the same spike look like slightly different shades, even though they came from the same plant. This is why comparing the oldest flower with the newest flower is so useful. Imagine a spike with 6 open blooms. The first one opened several weeks ago. The last one opened only recently. If the oldest bloom is pale lavender, the middle blooms are medium purple, and the newest one is still a rich violet, you are seeing a pattern that follows flower age. That pattern is much more informative than looking at one pale flower by itself. The change is moving gradually from oldest to newest, not appearing randomly in isolated patches. That does not prove that age is the only factor, but it moves age very high on the list. Most importantly, natural fading is not the same thing as the entire orchid declining. A flower can be nearing the end of its life, while the plant underneath it is perfectly healthy. Orchids invest energy into producing flowers, but flowers are temporary structures. Eventually they age and drop even when the leaves and roots remain strong. This is why I do not respond to a fading flower by automatically watering more or reaching for fertilizer. If the roots are healthy, the leaves are firm, the spike is stable, and the change is gradual across older flowers, I usually treat that as a normal part of the bloom cycle rather than a crisis. There is also a practical mistake to avoid here. Do not move a healthy Phalaenopsis into harsh, direct sun just because the flowers have become paler. Strong direct sun can overheat or scorch leaves and flowers, especially if the plant was previously growing in bright but filtered light. And do not assume extra fertilizer will restore the original color of an aging bloom. Fertilizer supports plant growth when used appropriately, but it does not rewind flower age. If the change is mainly caused by senescence, the most useful response is simply to keep the plant stable and healthy while the bloom cycle finishes naturally. But age cannot explain everything. Sometimes, the color difference appears not only between an old flower and a new flower, but between one blooming season and the next. The plant may bloom again months later, and the flowers look slightly warmer, cooler, lighter, darker, or differently patterned than you remember. That leads to the second reason: genetics. Every orchid has a genetic range that influences its flower shape, pattern, and pigment potential. In a named species, those traits are constrained by the species, although natural variation still exists. In hybrids, the range can be much more complex because the plant may carry traits from several parents. The color you see is the result of that genetic potential being expressed in a particular flower under particular growing conditions. That is why genetics is not the same as saying, this orchid must always produce exactly this shade forever. Genetics sets the possibilities, but the exact appearance can still vary. This becomes especially noticeable in complex Phalaenopsis hybrids. Two flowers from the same plant can be recognizably the same cultivar and still show small differences in saturation, spotting, blush, or the intensity of the lip. One blooming cycle may look a little deeper in color than another. The basic pattern usually remains recognizable, but the intensity can shift. That does not mean the plant has somehow changed its identity. It means the expression of its inherited traits is interacting with the conditions in which those flowers developed. Genetics also helps explain why different orchids respond differently to the same room. Put two Phalaenopsis hybrids side by side under the same light and temperature, and one may hold a strong magenta color, while another looks softer or fades faster. Their pigments, petal structure, flower longevity, and inherited tendencies are not identical. So, if you are trying to diagnose a color change, do not compare your plant too rigidly with a random photo online. Compare it first with its own newer flowers, its previous blooms if you have reliable photos, and the known appearance of that cultivar if it was labeled. This is also where I want to separate natural genetic color from commercial color. A naturally purple, pink, yellow, spotted, striped, or white Phalaenopsis is expressing traits from the plant itself. A commercially dyed blue orchid is a different situation, and we will come back to that because it can create one of the most dramatic color surprises in the entire orchid aisle. For now, the key point is that genetics provides the basic color blueprint, but it does not operate in isolation. Environmental conditions can influence how strongly that blueprint is expressed. And one of the easiest environmental clues to overlook is temperature. Temperature affects many processes inside a plant, including the development and stability of pigments. In flowering plants, pigment expression can shift under different temperature conditions, and orchids are no exception to environmental influence. But this is a place where simple internet rules can become misleading. You may hear statements such as, "Cool temperatures always make flowers darker," or "Warm temperatures always make them pale." Real plants are more complicated than that. The effect depends on the orchid, its genetics, the stage at which the flower was developing, and the range of temperatures involved. Temperature is one piece of the puzzle, not a universal switch. Think about what often happens to a grocery store Phalaenopsis. The flower, spike, and buds may have developed under controlled greenhouse conditions. The plant is then transported, displayed under store lighting, purchased, carried through outdoor air, and placed in a home that may be warmer during the day, cooler at night, drier, or much more variable. When the remaining buds continue opening after that move, you may be comparing flowers that completed different parts of their development under different conditions. Small differences in color or intensity are therefore not automatically evidence that something is wrong. Timing matters. If an orchid produced a rich color during one blooming season and a slightly softer color during another, ask what the growing environment was like while those buds were developing, not just what happened after the flowers opened. A dramatic change in household temperature after the bloom is already mature is not necessarily going to transform the pigment in a predictable way. That is why I would never recommend chasing flower color by constantly moving the plant between hot and cool locations. Stability is usually more useful than trying to manipulate one visual trait. There is another reason to be cautious with temperature. Extreme heat or cold can damage flowers directly. A plant left near a cold draft, a heating vent, or a hot sunny window may show shortened flower life, bud problems, or tissue damage. That is no longer a subtle pigment question, it is a stress question. So, if your orchid's flowers are changing color and also wilting prematurely, dropping buds, or developing damaged tissue, broaden the diagnosis. The color may be only one symptom among several. Temperature can matter, but many growers blame it for changes that actually begin with another environmental factor: light. Light is reason number 4, and it deserves careful handling because more light is one of the easiest orchid care ideas to misuse. Light affects the way plants grow and the way pigments are produced and perceived. But when we talk about flower color, we have to separate 3 different things. First, the light under which the flower developed. Second, the light under which you are currently viewing the flower. And third, whether the light level is appropriate for the health of the orchid itself. Those are related questions, but they are not identical. Start with perception. A purple orchid can look dramatically different near a cool, bright window than it does under warm household bulbs at night. Phone cameras can exaggerate that difference even further by changing white balance and exposure automatically. If you are comparing photos from different weeks, try to photograph the flower in the same place and roughly the same time of day. Otherwise, you may be measuring your camera and your lighting as much as the flower. Next, consider the plant's growing light. Phalaenopsis are generally adapted to bright but filtered conditions rather than intense, unprotected midday sun. A plant that receives too little light for a long period may grow differently and may not flower as well, while a sudden jump into strong, direct sun can damage leaves and flowers. So if the color changes, the answer is not to push the plant into the brightest window you have. Healthy orchid care comes first. Flower color is secondary. It is also possible for light environment during flower development to influence pigment expression. But again, genetics determines how each cultivar responds. That means you should look for patterns rather than use a single rule. If the orchid repeatedly blooms with a slightly different intensity after growing in a different location, and the plant is otherwise healthy, light may be one factor worth considering. If one old flower fades, while all the newer flowers remain richly colored, age is still a much stronger clue. The most useful question is not, how do I force this flower to become darker? The useful question is the light appropriate for this orchid, and does the color change fit the rest of what I am seeing? Check the leaves for signs of excess light or stress. Check whether the plant is receiving stable, indirect brightness. Look at how long the flowers are lasting. If everything else looks normal, a modest difference in shade does not justify a dramatic change in care. This is especially important because increasing light too aggressively can create a real problem while you are trying to solve an imaginary one. Sun-scald, overheated flowers, damaged leaf tissue, and rapid moisture loss are far more important than squeezing a slightly darker shade out of a bloom. If your orchid is healthy in its current location, adjust light only for plant health and flowering performance, not because you want an aging flower to match the color it had on day 1. There is a related factor people often lump together with ordinary light intensity, and that is ultraviolet exposure. UV is reason number 5. It is part of the light environment, but it is not a simple knob that orchid growers should turn up. Ultraviolet radiation can influence pigment systems in plants, including compounds that help absorb or respond to high-energy light. In some plants, changes in UV exposure can affect anthocyanin-related coloration, but that does not mean a home orchid grower should deliberately increase UV to darken flowers. The response depends on species, cultivar, tissue, developmental stage, and total light environment. Too much solar exposure can injure a Phalaenopsis long before you achieve any desirable cosmetic effect. So, how is UV useful in a diagnostic sense? Mainly as a reminder that 2 locations that look equally bright to our eyes may not provide the same spectrum of light. A greenhouse covering, window glass, sheer curtain, outdoor patio, and grow light setup can expose plants to different spectral conditions. If a plant blooms differently after a major change in environment, light spectrum, including UV, may be one part of the explanation, but it should remain a supporting clue, not the first conclusion. The safest practical advice is simple. Do not move an orchid into strong direct sun because you read that UV might intensify pigment. Do not remove protective shading solely to chase color. Keep the plant in an appropriate light range for its type. Watch the leaves and roots, and let flower color be an observation rather than a target that overrides plant health. Up to this point, every reason we have discussed can occur while the orchid itself remains healthy. Flowers can age. Genetics can produce variation. Temperature, light, and spectral conditions can influence appearance. But reason number 6 is different, because now I want you to stop looking only at the flower and inspect the entire plant. The 6th reason is stress. Stress is a broad word, so it is important not to use it as a vague explanation for everything. A plant is stressed when conditions push it away from healthy function. In orchids, that can include damaged roots, prolonged waterlogging, severe dehydration, sudden temperature extremes, low airflow combined with persistently wet media, salt buildup, pest pressure, or an abrupt environmental change. Any of those issues can reduce the plant's ability to maintain flowers normally. But if the only thing you see is a gradual change in petal color and the rest of the plant looks strong, stress should not automatically jump to the top of your list. Start with the roots. In a clear Phalaenopsis pot, healthy roots are often firm and may look silvery when dry and greener after watering. Some older roots naturally discolor, and roots buried in media may look different from aerial roots. So do not judge by color alone. What concerns me more is texture. Mushy, collapsing, hollow, or foul-smelling roots suggest a root problem. If many roots are failing at the same time, the flowers are fading rapidly and the leaves are losing firmness, then the color change is happening in a larger context of plant stress. Next, look at the leaves. A healthy Phalaenopsis leaf should generally feel firm for that plant and should not suddenly become limp, severely wrinkled, or rapidly yellow across multiple leaves. One old lower leaf aging naturally is different from widespread decline. Then inspect the flower spike and buds. Are buds continuing to swell and open? Are they yellowing and dropping before they open? Are flowers collapsing much earlier than expected? Again, one sign by itself does not tell the whole story. The pattern matters. Recent changes matter too. Did you repot the orchid while it was in bloom? Did it spend time in a hot car? Was it placed next to an air conditioning vent? Did you suddenly change the watering routine? Is the pot staying wet for much longer than before? Did the plant move from a humid greenhouse to a dry, heated room? Any of these events can affect flower longevity and overall stress. When multiple symptoms appear together, color change can be part of that story. This is where healthy roots can completely change how I interpret a fading flower. Imagine 2 orchids with pale blooms. The first has firm leaves, active root tips, a stable spike, and new buds opening normally. The second has limp leaves, widespread root loss, and buds dropping before they open. The flower color may look similar, but the diagnosis is not. The first plant may simply be moving through normal bloom aging or environmental variation. The second needs a much closer look at root health and growing conditions. And this is why I keep returning to the same principle. Do not treat a flower color change as a command to do something. Treat it as an invitation to observe. If the plant is stable, maintain stable care. If the plant is showing multiple stress signals, address the underlying problem rather than trying to fix the petals. You cannot repair an aging flower with extra water or fertilizer, but you can protect the next growth cycle by keeping roots, leaves, and media healthy. Now we reach the most surprising reason in the list, because there is one case where you can inspect the roots, temperature, and light perfectly and still fail to explain the original color. What if the color you were trying to preserve was never the orchid's natural flower color in the first place? That is the story behind many intensely blue Phalaenopsis orchids sold commercially. Naturally occurring blue is rare in the orchid world, and the electric blue Phalaenopsis, commonly seen in retail displays, is typically created by introducing dye into a white or pale flowered plant. The exact commercial method can vary, but the important point for the buyer is that the vivid blue appearance is not necessarily the genetic flower color of that orchid. This explains a classic mystery. Someone buys a bright blue orchid, keeps it alive, cares for it well, and months later celebrates when a new spike finally blooms. But the flowers open white, pale, or in another underlying natural shade. The owner thinks the plant lost something. Maybe the fertilizer was wrong. Maybe the light was wrong. Maybe the orchid forgot how to bloom blue. In reality, the new flowers are expressing the plant's natural genetics without the same artificial coloring treatment. Sometimes you can even see the transition on the original display spike. Newer flowers that opened after treatment may appear lighter or uneven compared with the first flowers. Dye can also be visible around an injection point or in parts of the spike, depending on how the plant was treated. But do not assume every unusual blue or violet orchid is dyed just from one photograph. Orchid breeding has produced an enormous range of natural purples, violets, lavenders, and unusual tones. The clue is the highly artificial electric blue appearance commonly marketed in dyed Phalaenopsis, combined with the plant's later return to its underlying flower color. The important care lesson is not that dyed orchids are automatically unhealthy. The lesson is simply that artificial color must be separated from natural pigment. If you buy one because you love the blue display, enjoy the flowers for what they are. But understand that future blooms may look very different. No amount of ordinary fertilizer, watering, or extra light is going to make the next bloom recreate a commercial dye treatment on its own. And please resist the temptation to inject dyes or household coloring into your own orchid just to copy the effect. Piercing plant tissue creates a wound and introduces unnecessary risk. If your goal is a healthy orchid that reblooms, the best strategy is to care for the plant according to its real needs and appreciate the natural color it produces. A dyed orchid can explain a dramatic color change, but there is one final category where I would not simply shrug and call the change normal. Reason number 8 is abnormal color break, or an irregular change in the flower pattern. Natural fading usually has a story you can follow. Older flowers become gradually softer in color. The change is relatively even. Newer flowers remain stronger for longer. Genetics may create expected spots, stripes, edges, or blush that repeat in a recognizable way. Environmental variation may shift intensity while the basic pattern remains familiar. Abnormal color break looks different because the pattern itself becomes inconsistent in a way that does not match normal aging. You might see irregular streaks, patches, blotches, or broken areas of color that appear suddenly or differ strongly from the cultivar's usual pattern. But this is exactly where responsible diagnosis matters. An irregular flower is not enough to declare a virus, disease, or permanent genetic problem. Physical damage while the bud was developing, temperature injury, chemical exposure, pest damage, genetic instability, and some infections can all produce abnormal-looking flowers. Even a single malformed bloom can occur without the rest of the plant being seriously affected. Some orchid viruses can produce color break or unusual flower patterns, which is why experienced growers take persistent, unexplained changes seriously. But visual appearance alone is not a reliable laboratory diagnosis. If the same abnormal pattern repeats, if several flowers are affected, if the plant shows additional suspicious symptoms, or if the orchid is part of a valuable collection where disease spread matters, isolation and proper testing become much more meaningful than guessing from a photo. So when you see an irregular color change, slow down, compare several flowers. Compare this bloom with older photos if you have them. Look at the leaves for unusual streaking, rings, or lesions. But remember, those signs can also have multiple causes. Check whether the flower was damaged while opening. Think about recent sprays, temperature events, or pests. And if the pattern persists, or you are genuinely concerned about infectious disease, keep the plant separate from other orchids until you know more. That is a cautious response without turning every strange petal into an emergency. The key question is no longer simply, did the color change? The key question is, how did the color change? And what else changed with it? A gradual, even fade on the oldest blooms tells a very different story from irregular streaking that appears across several new flowers. A blue orchid returning to white tells a very different story from a naturally purple hybrid becoming slightly lighter late in its bloom cycle. Context is everything. At this point, you can place almost every orchid flower color change into one of three practical categories. The first is normal. That includes gradual aging, genetic variation, and modest differences linked to the environment when the plant is otherwise healthy. The second is artificial. That includes commercially dyed flowers, especially the vivid blue Phalaenopsis that may later return to their natural underlying color. The third is investigate. That is where the pattern is irregular, repeated, or accompanied by other signs of stress, root decline, bud failure, tissue damage, or possible disease. And notice what is missing from that decision system. There is no category called panic and change everything. If your orchid's flowers fade, do not immediately flood the pot. Double the fertilizer, cut the spike, or move the plant into blazing sun. Start with observation. Compare old and new flowers. Check the roots. Check the leaves. Think about the environment and the history of the plant. Then decide whether anything actually needs to change. The goal is not to force every orchid flower to stay exactly the same color from the first day it opens until the last. Flowers are living structures, and they change. The goal is to understand what that change is telling you before you change the way you care for the orchid. If the plant is healthy and the fading follows flower age, enjoy the rest of the bloom cycle. If the original color was artificial, enjoy the surprise when the plant shows you what it naturally produces. And if the pattern truly looks abnormal, investigate carefully instead of guessing. Thanks for spending this time with me and your orchids. If this helped you understand what your flowers are telling you, subscribe for more practical orchid care, and give the video a like so more growers can find it. And in the comments, tell me what color your orchid was when you bought it, what color it is now, and whether the change happened gradually or all at once. Your plant's story may help another grower recognize the same pattern